Dear Chairman, dear ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure and honor to speak here in Maastricht, which is one of the most important centers for cardiac electrophysiology. And yes, now I hope that I can soon start to give my presentation.
Yes.
Perfect, wonderful. So I'm going to speak about substrate modification in paroxysmal AF, particularly in the FIRMAP AF trial. These are my disclosures. So as you know, the cornerstone of AF ablation at present time is the PV isolation, and the basic concept is very simple. It's, there is a trigger, we isolate the trigger and keep the trigger in the veins. However, I think that PV isolation is much more than isolation. It's always, we also do like GP ablation and a lot of substrate modification. The outcome of PV isolation by its own is pretty good. We are just submitted from our previous group, where I was working with Karl-Heinz Cook's lab for 10 years, and this is the data from this lab, which we just submitted. So the long-term outcome, the 10-year outcome for PV isolation in patients with paroxysmal AF and patients without structural heart disease is very good. As we know, repeat procedures are frequent, but then the success rates are more than 60% over a follow-up of 10 years. So in 2017, what are the two main options? It's either a contact force-guided PV isolation with RF energy or the cryoballoon technology. However, we know that AF is not only a simple disease caused by a trigger, and maybe PV isolation is not the only solution. And there are other concepts like multiple wavelet hypothesis or rotor hypothesis, which have led to different concepts like Cox-Maze procedure or linear concepts or rotor-guided ablation. And the other strategies like linear ablations or cafe ablations have been evaluated in the STAR-AF2 trial, and the outcome was disappointing, and that's why at present time, at least as a first-line therapy for the first procedure in patients with paroxysmal and persistent AF, I think we don't have enough data to support additional ablations such as linear ablation or cafe ablation in the first procedure. So we need other concepts such as rotor ablation or maybe GP ablation that are under evaluation but not established therapies so far. The rotor concept is an old concept. However, we didn't use it in clinical practice because we couldn't use it in clinical practice because we had no rotor mapping system for humans during an EP procedure. However, in 2011, Sanjeev Narayan brought this concept into AF ablation. No matter what you think about the data, I think it was a very valuable publication since it brought the new concept into AF ablation. And he could demonstrate rotors, he could ablate rotors, and he could terminate AF when he ablated the rotors. So what rotor mapping system do we have? At present time, there are many different rotor mapping systems available. There is the Topera system, which is based on a basket catheter. It's an endocardial system. There is the CartoFinder system, which is also based on an endocardial basket catheter. It's also a contact mapping system. There is the EP solution system, which is an non-contact mapping system where you project the rotors on an MRI scan and you can do an endo and epicardial map. And there is the Cardio Insight system from the Bordeaux group, which is an epicardial mapping system. We at the present institution, we currently work with the Topera system, which is consisting of a basket catheter with 8 electrodes and 8 splines, and the magic black box, a console where all the data is analyzed. So what is the approach? This approach, we follow the same approach that we did in Hamburg at the previous institution. We do a double transeptal puncture. We induce AF if it is required. Then we perform a rotor mapping system using the rhythm view mapping system in combination with the Fermap catheter. And then we apply irrigated RF current for 300 seconds at each rotor. Why 300 seconds? We have to agree it's arbitrary, but just to keep it standardized. And then we remap. And we repeat the rotor mapping until all rotors identified are ablated in both atria. We start with the right atrium, then we go to the left atrium. After rotor ablation, so outside the randomized trial, we did the PV isolation. Now within the randomized trial, we do not isolate the veins in this patient population. That's what the basket catheter looks like in the left atrium. You see the basket catheter, which has in this patient pretty good wall contact. We injected some contrast to visualize the left atrium, and it's very important that you get good wall contact since it's a contact mapping system. What does it look like? The first version of the rotors looked very difficult to interpret. However, now they have new technologies introduced, like the REP, which is, stands for repetitive activation patterns, and it helps you to identify rotors. And I think even now, even if you're not used to look at rotors, you can see a rotor in the left map. Around the core of the rotor is visualized in red. And then you can use a spotlight, which even helps you to improve the visualization of the rotor. So I think that makes it a little bit more transparent and reproducible. Initial success rates were very promising from the confirmed trial, where they had an 80% AF freedom after a single procedure when PVI plus FERM ablation was performed. And it was much better as compared to the PVI arm. They had only 44% in the PVI arm. And they also did a post hoc analysis, and I think the concept is very provocative. They analyzed what predicted outcome, and they found that if you ablated all sources, no matter whether it was on purpose or accidentally during PV isolation, the outcome was very, very good. You had more than 80% success rate. Whereas if you missed all sources during PV isolation, the outcome was very, very poor. So that their hypothesis is that PV isolation is just accidental rotor ablation. Anyway, what I truly believe is that if we do PV isolation, it is more than isolation of the trigger. I think we change the substrate, we ablate GPs. There is many unknown things that we do. The data from this group was very consistent, no matter whether it was in puff or persistent. You had success rates of about 80% if you do the PVI plus a rotor-guided ablation. And then they did a precise puff study where they only did a rotor-guided ablation and left the veins open, and the success rates were as good as PVI plus rotor-guided ablation, and they said, which in their eyes confirmed the hypothesis that PVI is only rotor-guided ablation. However, what about other data? There is data from other groups, like from this group, which was just published in Hart+Vaat, Nordisch group, and they did rotor-guided ablation only without PV isolation in 27 patients, and they had an AF recurrence rate, not success rate, recurrence rate of 85%, which is very disappointing. There is another group, Steinberg et al. Published just recently in Hart+Vaat, their experience of rotor-guided ablation in addition to PV isolation in patients with persistent AF. And the patient had a mean number of prior ablations of 1. But in this patient population, even though the veins were isolated, the outcome was very, very poor. The Leipzig experience is very different. They published a consecutive series of 20 patients in patients with long-standing persistent AF and failed prior PV isolation. And they terminated AF in only 5% of the patients, but rotor-guided ablation, in addition to PVI, resulted in a success rate of 80% in this very sick patient population. The only randomized trial so far is the OSIS trial that you might all be aware of, where they randomized from the Natali group, where they randomized PVI versus rotor-guided ablation versus PVI plus trigger elimination, and their standard of care, so PVI plus trigger elimination, had the best outcome. However, this study was retracted. So in conclusion, I think current evidence about the outcome following rotor-guided ablation is very, very conflicting. And robust data about the efficacy of rotor-guided ablation is lacking. So we just started the FIRM-AF study, which stands for focal impulse and rotor-modulation ablation versus pulmonary vein isolation for the treatment of paroxysmal AF. The sponsor is Abbott. Philipp Sommer from Leipzig is the co-PI, and it's a multi-center trial. The rationale behind is that rotor-guided ablation shows promising results, but it needs further evaluation. And the primary objective of the trial is to compare the safety and efficacy of firm-guided ablation with conventional RF-based PV isolation procedures for treatment of paroxysmal AF without prior catheter ablation. The hypothesis is, as we said, it's a non-inferiority trial. The primary endpoint is freedom from AF between 3 to 12 months, including a 30 days planking period, 90 days planking period. 170 patients will be one-to-one randomized. And secondary endpoints in the firm group are elimination of all rotors, and in the control group, isolation of all PVs. Key inclusion criteria are at least 2 documented AF episodes of paroxysmal AF within the last 3 months, left atrial diameter of less than 5 centimeter, and of course the patient needs sustained AF of more than 5 minutes during the EP study. It can be induced with or without isoproteirenol infusion. Key exclusion criteria is previous AF ablation procedure. Patient will be followed up at 3, 6, and 12 months with 72-hour Holter recordings or implantable devices, and other parameters such as quality of life will also be assessed in this study. So that's the flow chart. Patient with paroxysmal AF, they will be randomized either to PV isolation or firm-up ablation only, as I said, with the veins kept open. The primary endpoint is freedom from AF at 12 months. Initially, we already randomized 31 patients so far. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I would like to come to my conclusion. PVI remains the cornerstone of most AF ablation procedures. Data about rotor-guided ablation for treatment of paroxysmal AF is controversial, and the FIRM-AF AF trial is the first randomized controlled trial comparing rotor-guided ablation alone with the current gold standard of PVI alone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roland. I'm sure there are questions. Roma, Harry, please.
Thank you very much, Roland. Nice presentation. Your conclusion is somewhat contradictory, though, saying that the cornerstone of ablation is PVI, yet you embark on a study where PVI is not the general scheme for all patients. So you must be pretty confident that the alternative approach is going to work.
No, I'm not confident that the alternative approach is working, but initially when we started with the protocol, there was only very, very positive data published about rotor-guided ablation only, no? A lot of positive data. Now in the last 1.5 years, there's increasing conflicting data or negative data. My goal is, I would like to find it out. And I mean, there are more than 4,000 Topera cases have been performed so far. And we don't have a single randomized trial evaluating the effect of rotor-guided ablation. So I say if I perform a rotor-guided ablation, I do it within a randomized trial. And I think that's the right way to approach new technology. I don't like the idea of performing like otherwise 10,000 rotor-guided ablations without any single randomized controlled trial. So all the rotor-guided ablations we do within a trial. And I want to find out, I'm really surprised I'm really curious what the outcome is going to be.
I have a question for you, Roland. Could you tell us a little bit about your ideas about the relation between the rotors you see and the actual anatomy of the atrium? So how important, my first question is actually, are those rotors you see as constant in space, as also reported by Sanjeev Narayan? And the second question is, did you try to somehow visualize the anatomy of the atrium in your system? And what is your opinion on the anatomy as a determinant of the localization of those stable rotors?
So, very good question. The first thing is about rotor stability. We always perform two maps, two consecutive maps. And we look at the first map, we mark, document where the rotor is, and then we repeat the map. And only if it's a consistent rotor in both maps, then we burn the rotor. And I would say 1 out of 3 maps is not reproducible. I mean, the entire window where we analyze the rotors is very short because we do both maps within 5 minutes. So we don't have the data like some groups claim they remain stable over 24 hours or even longer. I have no data about that. But if you do 2 consecutive maps with the same technology, with this technology, you see the rotors on the same spot in 2 out of 3 maps. That's what I would say. So in every third rotor that we identify, we don't find it in the next map.
And how are they related to anatomical structures?
Yes. We did actually. We published the localization of the rotors in Europace, I think 2017 or 16, pretty recently, for our first 25 patients from Hamburg, and they are predominantly they were in the left atrium. So it was. We had a mean number of 3 rotors per patient and 0.5 rotors per patient in the right atrium. Every second patient had a rotor in the right atrium. And the predominant site for the rotors were the anterior wall of the left atrium and the ridge. So these were these were the predominant sites of the rotors with this mapping system.
So, we are all very interested, of course, in the question, what makes that those rotors are very constant over time, and we are all exposed to the impression of a highly variable, let's say, configuration of atrial electrograms recorded during atrial fibrillation, which is kind of not so consistent with the idea that you have a very repetitive pattern of activation at a single site. So if you look at what is a constant factor that possibly could determine the localization or the presence of reentry circuits, then the anatomy is obviously the only constant factor that is out there. So could it be that some of the rotors that are very stable, identified by such systems, are reentries around PVs or around the antrum or around any constant anatomical structure?
I mean, I think reentries around the PVs, I don't think it, because it wouldn't fit with the size of the rotors, no? Because it's distant to the PVs. It's more, so either it's on the anterior wall, which is it's the other side of the atrium, of course, or it's more at the left atrial isthmus, no? And I think a macro reentry around the veins would be much, much bigger. But honestly speaking, I mean, we have a completely approach as you. I mean, you probably can tell us much, much more about rotors than I can tell you, because we just interpret what the system tell us to be and then a blade based on the output of the system, what it visualizes. But why they are there, I'm not sure, but I think at least in these areas there is a lot of different, the fiber orientation at least is more complex, no? One is where the Bachmann's bundle is, where it's penetrating the right atrium to the left atrium. You have the fibers going in different areas, and it's similar at the left atrium isthmus. So maybe this contributes, I don't know. But by the way, we would be happy to share the electrograms with you, and if you would like to analyze them in your labs, you're more than
Oh,
welcome.
great. Oh, I think this is a fantastic
Yeah?
idea. Let's talk about that. That's certainly interesting. Are there any further questions from the audience? No? Okay, then Bart Maassen is going to announce the next speaker.